Hello, everybody. All of us know that India is right now fighting a very severe second wave of COVID-19 infections. When COVID-19 first hit India, we had a 68-day long, almost a complete lockdown. And it apart from everything else, the health cost, it also had a very severe economic cost on the economy. And the Indian economy, as of now, we know that the GDP will contract by 8%, which is the largest ever contraction on record. In post-independence India. Now that we are all dealing with the second wave, which at least in health terms is far more severe than the first wave. The question also arises as to what will be its economic impact on the Indian economy. Whether it will be worse, whether it will be not as bad as the first impact was, etc. We still do not have a lot of statistics. So right now, everybody, this is still the first quarter of the fiscal year. So everybody is sort of speculating as to what it can be. And today we have with us Professor Himanshu, who is an associate professor of economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, who is one of the most accomplished economists who look at the Indian economy in our generation. And he's also a regular columnist. He writes in the Mint newspaper on the state of the economy, etc. And we thought that we would discuss with Himanshu as to what the situation is right now and what it is likely to be. Welcome, Himanshu, and thanks a lot for agreeing to do this. Let me just start with the first question. All of us know that the second wave is far more severe than the first wave, but a lot of economists, both private and institutional, including the RBI governor, who had a press conference a few days ago, they have said that the economic impact of the second wave will not be as severe as what the first wave had. What do you think about such a view?
Well, it depends on the where you are looking at from. I mean, obviously, we had a very bad impact on the economy last year itself. So once you factor in the fact that the economy already suffered quite a bit in the last 1 year, and this is the last financial year, then obviously the impact is not going to be much compared to that. But if you compare it with, say, for example, the 1920 financial year, then obviously we are in a situation where our economy will not recover even to the situation that we were there at the end of the 1920 financial year. So if you compare it back to then I think we are going to be still at a situation where the per capita income or overall per capita GDP will be much lower than what we started with in the 1920. So I think it depends on that. And I think the optimism that you see is the optimism is coming from the fact that we already had a contraction of around 8.5% or to 9% in the last year. So obviously, things are more likely to go beyond. I mean, it's the same kind of a contraction on the back of an 8.5 to 9% contraction is not something which is possible. So that's what the level of optimism comes from. But I think it's a false level of optimism. And I think in some ways, our aggregate GDP numbers, or in fact, our aggregate numbers in many ways, many numbers that we're looking at, is not reflective of the level of crisis that we are dealing with, particularly the level of stress that we are dealing with in the economy, whether in terms of the health expenditure or in terms of normal expenditure of the households in the rural areas, the kind of distress that the majority of the population, the bottom end of the population is going through. Those are things which are not going to be captured in the macro data or aggregate data at this point of time. But there are definitely pressure points, pain points which are there, which are very much visible. And any complacency on that front would be similar to the kind of complacency that we had as far as the virus pandemic is concerned. I would say that, in fact, that can be far more disastrous than the kind of complacency that we had when we talked about that we have conquered the vaccine, we have conquered the pandemic. And I think, at least on that count, I mean, at least the policymakers and everybody I'm talking about, policymakers should be far more cautious than they are appearing at this point of time.
So, just for the benefit of our viewers, so you are basically saying that in terms of just the GDP numbers, we will actually it will not be we are not going to see an 8% contraction in fiscal year 21-22 again, but that should not be interpreted to imply that the second wave did not affect the economy. And because you said our GDP numbers are not adequate, what are the numbers we should be looking at? And we will come to this later in our discussion as to do we even have those numbers. But if you were to say just one or two numbers, what are the numbers we should be looking at if we are arguing that the GDP numbers probably do not capture the real pain of the pandemic?
But I mean, let me start with the GDP numbers. For example, if you have a contraction of roughly 8.5 to 9%, which is what is expected if you take an average of various numbers that are floating around, and you have a recovery of something like say real growth of roughly 9% to 9.2%, even then, your per capita GDP in 2022 April will be lower than your per capita GDP in 2020.
Because of the population growth effect.
Simply the population growth, but even if you take out the population growth effect, the fact that you had a 9% decline, you need a much higher decline to even compensate for that decline, because we're talking about percentages decline in that sense. So that's something which is where, so a growth of 9.5% is still not enough for us to bring back to the situation that we were there at the end of the 1920 financial year. And we are certainly going down. Everybody has started revising it downwards, and I think the process of revising downwards will go further. But I think even that is an overestimate, right? Because we are not still filtering out the data. And some of the data, for example, the non-banking companies or, for example, smaller financial companies are still trickling in. We still have data only up to, say, September or October. We don't have, and those data, as they're trickling in, you will see some kind of a sharp downward revision in the numbers that were projected in the last 1.5 years. So I think we are not yet out.
In the official GDP numbers, you mean?
In the official GDP numbers, and that has been the trend for the last 2 to 3 years, definitely. But if you take the longer term period of 4 to 5 years, a definite trend that you can see that there has been a sharp downward revision in most of the growth numbers. But I think what we are missing out, as forget about the GDP numbers, which is just one metric that we're talking about. But if you look at the various other metrics, then we are very much clear the wage recovery has not yet happened. We are still, I mean, the last data that we have is from the Labour Bureau is from March 2021. And if you compare in real terms, the March 2021 real wages in agriculture as well as non-agriculture are lower than what they were in March 2019. So that's the reality that we're talking about in the last 2 years. If you're looking at, say, various other indicators of it, whether it is coming from private service, for example, because government services are not so much regularly available, but employment numbers have again gone back to the situation. But even after recovery, the CMI data clearly shows that we are still not at the level of employment that we started with before the pandemic. The unemployment levels are obviously going to fluctuate. The income levels are very much clear. And remember, in 2017-18 is the last time we had the consumption expenditure survey, which was junked by the government. But that data itself showed a poverty level increasing compared to 2011-12. And after that, things have simply gone backwards. Levels of incomes have gone down. The level of misery has actually increased. The availability and access to food has actually gone down. So I think there are pressure points which are again very much visible, and these are available. I mean, we don't have to look at for numbers of those ones. But again, inflation numbers, we are looking at it, and I would say that this is something which I've been pointing out, that we are still not out of the woods. I mean, we need to be looking at it much more carefully than the numbers suggest at this point of time. So I think we are in a much more precarious situation than, say, for example, in April 2020. Because in April 2020, whatever you say, the economy was slowing down, but we still had a positive growth of around 4%. We still had something to back up. We are now where the economy is not in a position to take back-to-back 2 years of misery. The rural economy is definitely not in a position to do that. And the policy-induced stress, and I'm going to talk about, if you ask questions as to how, again, government policies are going to create havoc in the rural economy. Instead of recovering pointing towards recovering the rural economy, we are actually taking policy decisions which might have a very, very bad impact on the rural incomes, which are already under stress for the last 4 to 5 years.
Let us talk about the rural economy. So last year, even though the overall economy contracted, agriculture was the only bright spot. What do you see? This time, I mean, we have every evidence, both anecdotal and otherwise, that the pandemic has actually proliferated in rural economy, in rural areas in a big way. The other thing is, there also seems to be a terms of trade impact happening, because prices of diesel have gone up, prices of fertilizers have gone up. So farm incomes would definitely be under a squeeze. What do you think all this means for the rural demand cushion which the economy actually had last year? Can we take it for granted this year? If not, how bad is the situation right now?
This is precisely the point that I was talking about, and you have really pointed out. And in fact, the last time we were in a situation like this was 2011-12, when in spite of the fact that food inflation was very high, agricultural commodity prices were going up. But in spite of that, because of the input prices rising faster, and again, the same two issues, the petroleum prices as well as the fertilizer prices, and the same thing again, which is happening now, led to a situation that by 2013-14, agricultural incomes have collapsed. And it's something which is Niti Aayog also pointed out it's the number that they had. So we are again seeing a situation where this time the demand has already contracted. and the demand has not only contracted, the ability of the government to pump prime the rural economy through massive expenditure in the rural areas is also, we are not seeing that kind of a step being taken by the government. So therefore, we don't expect the same kind of boost to NREGA or to various other rural. So already the government, the demand has contracted. 1 year of painful process of pandemic-led economic distress is there. Secondly, the ability of the government to pump prime the rural economy is no longer there. So I don't think anything that is going to happen. Third, you have already pointed out that input prices have risen much faster. Remember, last year in February and March, petroleum prices collapsed drastically. Although not much of that was passed to the rural economy, but at least fertilizer prices were not touched upon. The petroleum prices did not see a reduction, but there was not much of an increase that happened at that point of time. But since then, there have been a massive increase in petroleum prices, at least since January onwards. We have seen fertilizer prices rising by 30% to 60% as far as the complex fertilizers are concerned, and we know it very well. This is past experience is very, very clear that this will impact the urea prices and therefore overall weighted average of prices in fertilizer. Already fertilizer consumption has declined by 60 to 70% between 1st of May to 11th of May, the daily tracker that we have that comes from the Fertilizer Association of India data. So I think there is obviously a pressure point, and this will have an impact on the rural economy. And most of the third point I think which I wanted to highlight is that, remember, this pandemic has led to massive out-of-pocket expenditure on health. And this is something which is where most of the households have spent anywhere from around 5,000 rupees to 30,000 rupees to somewhere going up to lakhs for even getting basic medical facilities, oxygen and beds and various other things. So whatever little reserves that they had in the household, that reserve is lost. And in 1 year of this process, when they had no income, no jobs, they had to go back to the rural areas. They had to come back again in search of job in the urban areas. They are now starting with a net debt. Most of the rural households will start with a net debt and a debt serviceability, which will be again mostly in the hands of the private non-institutional sources with a higher rate of interest. So I think the rural areas are no longer being seen as something which will lead to the recovery in the economy. So I think that's something which is out of the question. The question is, can the urban now pull up, or can the non-agricultural sector is sufficient enough to pull up the rest of the economy? My own understanding and talking from people and talking from various other sources is that is definitely not the case. So we are in a much worse situation than what we were there. If you were talking to me, say for example, on May 12th or 13th, 2020, compared to now 1 year down the line, our hands are tied. We are in much worse situation than what we started with.
Himanshu, CPI numbers were released yesterday, for April. And the cereal and products category, actually prices have contracted by more than 2.5%. This is the largest ever contraction in this category in the new CPI series. Now, we have also heard the government saying that there has been record procurement of wheat and rice. What do you think explains this? Cereals are something which prices have always been by and large stable. What explains this abnormal contraction in cereal prices in India?
Let me put it like three ways. Again, the inflation numbers have to be read very carefully. Remember, the inflation number that we're talking about is YOY, year on year. And remember, last year, April and May inflation numbers were not released. What we have numbers for last year are basically imputations, which were done as the post-facto exercise by the ministry. But take it as so we had, as a result of it, in March and April last year, when there was complete lockdown, March and April complete lockdown, we had a food inflation which was up close to 10% and overall inflation close to 7%. And at that point of time when the demand had actually collapsed. So there is something which is, that effect is also, which is what you see comparing with the last year. But the cereal price and other things is a trend that for that you'll have to actually look at what is happening to the international prices. If you look at the FAO World Price Index, those numbers are again showing exactly the same number that we're getting from here, which is that the cereal prices are in negative there also. It is basically being led by meat products, milk products. Here, unlike the
oil seeds.
In the international market, here what we are seeing is some kind of a decline in the market, but edible oil, pulses and all those commodities are showing an increase as well. Reality is that as of now, demand in the rural economy, demand in the urban economy has collapsed. And this collapse in demand is going to get reflected in food prices at least for the next 2-3 months. But we don't have to be complacent about it, because we also are looking at the fact that at least for commodities like edible oil and pulses, which have large import content, domestic price transmission international price transmission is also leading to higher price increases. And at some point of time, even the cereal prices will start seeing an uptick as the international prices start firming up. The production data that we have available for cereal production coming from the FAO for international market is there. That the projection is that even the cereal prices will start firming at some point of time, and we will have a situation where overall commodity prices, overall agricultural prices, including cereal prices, will start inching positive. So as of now, I'd say I think it's primarily a result of demand deflation, which is being reflected in the, but also a large part is coming from international price transmission, where most of the cereals have seen negative prices in the last 3 to 4 months.
So you are saying we should not take this for granted. Prices can actually rise.
Definitely.
Food inflation will be a problem going forward. Let us come to slightly larger issues, Himanshu. Like you said in the beginning that we actually had a consumption expenditure survey in 2017-18, but the government junked its findings. So now we are in a situation where our latest officially recognized consumer expenditure survey is from 2011-12. That also means that both our GDP series and our CPI series have not been updated, whereas the updation was due, and we are dealing with a slightly obsolete set of numbers. As a policy economist, the Indian economy is dealing with its largest ever economic disruption. How bad is it from a policy making perspective to be dealing with such a situation with a set of obsolete statistical databases?
Or the fact that most of the data is faulty, and the government led to a situation of complacency as far as the government's response to the pandemic is concerned. I think the same thing is happening as far as economic indicators are concerned. We are in complete dark as far as the most of the data, and including the GDP revision, the prices data, the various other data that we're supposed to get at the interval. The fact that the data is not available, it makes it much more difficult for the policymakers to design policies to take into account all these problems. But I think we are saying, we are looking at a situation that these are problems which are not going to be recovered. We are not going to actually come to a situation where the problem is to be taken care in the next 1 year or next 2 years. The situation is so bleak that the government has in fact stopped releasing the data. I mean, a good point of that example is the situation assessment survey of farmers, survey of which was completed in 2019, but we still have not, that the data has not been released. And here we are talking about the issue of farmers' income, we are talking about doubling farmers' income. But the government is so cautious about not releasing data, so scared of the data, official data that is coming out from the official sources or independent sources, what I will say, is that it simply is blocking the data. So we are basically creating a kind of a mirage where we are creating a feel-good situation, but the reality is something that cannot be hidden, just as dead bodies cannot be hidden, even though you might actually try and hide the number of infection or number of cases, caseloads coming out. It will ultimately show up at some point of time. And it is actually showing up in different ways, whether we accept it or
not. The other thing is, and a lot of economists had actually talked about it. People said that last year's economic recovery was actually profit-led rather than wage-led. And databases such as Proves show that companies cut employee costs, even though their revenues had not increased, their profits actually increased. Now that and the labor is already operating under a squeeze, and commodity prices internationally are going up, which means manufacturing costs will also go up. Do you think this is sustainable anymore? The profit-led recovery model, is it sustainable anymore in the Indian economy?
No, definitely no. I mean, you also must take into account that the profit-led was also being driven by what was done in September 2019 in terms of the massive tax break that was given, the reduction in taxes that was given to the companies. So they had a bull run, kind of a very good run as far as profits were concerned in the last 2 years. But again, I would say that they have hit the rock bottom. I mean, you can't basically push it any further. I mean, whatever cost reduction they could have achieved by simply cutting down on employee cost or wage cost or by taking away the workers, that I think they have reached. I mean, any more is not possible. And with the rising cost of commodities and with the rising commodity prices of inputs, I think this channel of profit-led growth in the corporate sector that we're looking at, I don't think that's something which is feasible. It's just a matter of time before the chain breaks or at least comes to a halt. We will have to just wait and watch this whole process happening. But as of now, I would say that we have hit the rock bottom, and I don't think this is the way we can continue going any further.
The other thing, Himanshu, is everybody is rightfully concerned about the pandemic's impact on poverty. And even though we do not have official poverty numbers because we do not have a CES, For example, the Azim Premji University released a report last week where they said that income poverty, if you look at income poverty, then it has increased by almost 230 million, etc. But what about the pandemic's impact on the non-poor? We know that India is a very unequal economy, and the rich actually have a disproportionate share in driving consumption, and which actually drives growth in this country. What do you think will be the pandemic's impact on the non-poor?
Pandemic, overall has led to an increase in inequality, and that increase in inequality. So we might quibble about what is the exact number of people who have moved, who have gone into poverty. The number of poor has increased by whatever amount. We don't have the official data, but at least nobody disagrees on the fact that there is going to be an increase in poverty. Whether it is 150 million or 250 million or 300 million, that depends from what methodology you are using. Similarly, the impact on inequality is also very clear, and that again is coming from the nature of recovery, or the nature of the way the pandemic has hit. It is certainly of the issue, which is where a large number of the people in the poorer sections have been hit, their jobs have been hit, and they're moved into informal sector. But again, that process is over. But what is not documented, and which is coming out less talked about, is a large part of the middle class or the regular employees have moved into self-employed. That's something that is coming from the PLFS data. That is also something which is coming from the CMI data. That the regular workers, or people who had stable job or had stable source of income, even they have lost jobs and their incomes have actually declined. So there is a kind of shrinking that is happening in the middle. On the and they have benefited out of the massive run in the stock market or profit-led growth that has happened in the corporate sector. The net impact of that is going to be the increase in inequality in all dimensions. The fact that areas are now suffering much more than areas. The cost of private hospital care expenditure, hospital expenditure, is much more falling on the people who are at without any social security support or without any protection available either from the employer or from the state, are going to be hurt much more than those who are well protected. It basically means that the inequality is going to hurt. Going to increase in all dimensions, across classes, across rural, urban, across states. All that is something which is very, very clear. But it is an inequality that I think is where the impact will be there. And this increase in inequality is not just going to be an inequality, which is one-off increase in inequality, which is going to last only up to the pandemic is there. But it is something which is going to also impact intergenerational mobility. And simply because that is coming from the fact that access to education itself is determined by what kind of resources you have. We see that happening, that a lot of students, and we're not even talking about these ones because we don't have concrete data on that. There's a lot of students are falling behind as far as access to education is concerned, and they're not able to access education. And that will something which will play out in longer run in, say, for example, 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line. Or, for example, households starting with a huge debt, with a huge servicing of debt at a higher rate of interest, will also basically impact to move into as far as upward mobility is concerned. But I think the issue here is that what it has done is that the essential spending is not being affected, and that's why the poor are more protected. But a lot of discretionary spending is going to be cut. A lot of households are going to cut. Even the middle classes have started cutting down the discretionary spending. So it will have an impact of inequality, but it will also have an impact on the overall growth sustainability, because the discretionary spending is the one which is basically also going to lead to your revival of the economy as the non-agricultural sector, whether it is the mobile phones or various other discretionary spending that you're talking about. That source is down. It will have an impact on economic growth, and it will lead to further generation of inequality, because the economy will not be in a position to generate a good amount of jobs. So I think we are in a vicious spiral rather than in a virtuous spiral, and that will have a long-term impact on the overall economy.
Just to get a clarity on what you're saying, Himanshu, we have heard this for a very long time now, because the Indian economy was in a prolonged slowdown even before the pandemic. A lot of people had kept on saying that the economy has bottomed out, and every year we would see that it would actually hit a new bottom. So are you saying that even as far as the pandemic is concerned, what we are actually looking at is not a cyclical shock, but what could be a very deep, serious structural shock to the Indian economy's growth prospects?
It's precisely the point that I'm talking about, that we had these structural factors up, which were also responsible for the reason why the economy was slowing down, is because the nature of the demand, the structure of demand itself was skewed in favor of a certain section of the population, and their ability to expand demand was limited. Again, a large part of your population is not contributing to demand, then you'll have a problem. Unless the export demand picks up and fills up that gap that is being created by domestic. We are not in a situation like that. And we are not comfortable in that situation. Those structural factors have been exposed by the pandemic, and it has very clearly exposed those pandemic. But what it has also done is that it has basically widened the gap that was already there. Those gaps have widened, and those widening of those gaps basically mean that we cannot simply assume things to be a cyclical, like just a part of the cycle, in the sense that it is bottomed out and therefore it has no way up to go. But we are in a situation where these structural bottlenecks will create fissures or will create problems which will not be, if you don't correct those ones, then I think we can forget about getting into a sustainable growth rate of say around 6% or 7%, whatever number that we're talking about. So I think we need to be worried about not just about what is happening at the short run, in the sense the short run growth numbers, but we also be worried about the policy responses to the structural gaps, which will create a situation where any recovery may be transient, may only be a very, very short run, but at least the recovery will not be something which will be sustainable, and it will be very, very painful. It will something which will require a huge amount of way we are our understanding of the economy itself. I don't think that is something which is going into our policymakers' head, or they are even thinking about those issues at this point of time. They're just hoping against hope, which is what most of the time it is. I mean, anything that comes down has to go up. I mean but I think it's not a question of anything that goes down has to come up. We are in a situation where the ship itself is sinking at a very, very faster rate, unless the loopholes are plugged in, and we have to start thinking about that.
Himanshu, last year there was a lot of debate between whether the policy intervention should have been monetary or fiscal, and we know that the central government's fiscal stimulus was at the end of it, not very high. This time the debate seems to have been, that the government actually should have imposed a lockdown much earlier. Now, I mean, most states are already under a lockdown, but the central government has still not imposed a lockdown. I mean, whereas it was very quick to impose a lockdown last year when caseload was much lower. In hindsight, do you think we should have imposed a lockdown, say, somewhere around March or something, so that the pandemic could have been prevented?
I sincerely think that was something which was required, and a kind of a lockdown, or at least some kind of strategic planning on what is to be done. I mean, where exactly the lockdown has to be imposed. Maybe if you want to do it carefully, I mean, there are ways of doing it. I mean, rather than blindly announcing 4 hours notice and saying that the whole country is shut down. I mean, that was disastrous, but that doesn't mean that the entire policy apparatus itself is problematic. I think what the government missed out was not just an understanding of how to tackle the pandemic, but also actually went into overconfidence, which is where I think the Kumbh congregation, or for example, the fact that elections were allowed to happen and many people were allowed to gather in those states without any protection, without any backup plan of what is happening, simply monitoring of what is going on in those places, it itself led to a complacency and led to a situation where we are actually scrambling to get into lockdowns. And this is something which has been handed over to states to take into account, where the entire responsibility has been passed on to the states, starting from the Disaster Management Act, where the power is centralized. So I think this is a complete, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a policy paralysis. Actually, the state has disappeared. The state is no longer there in the picture. And that is why we are coming into a situation where there is kind of a free-for-all way. But I think the lockdown was necessary. But more than the lockdown, if you really wanted to avoid lockdown, there are many steps that were available with the government to actually make sure that we didn't reach the kind of situation that we have reached with the second wave of pandemic. Management, or for example, the Kumbh crowd management, or for example, various other things that have contributed to the complacency that came into the system. So I think the issue is not just whether lockdown or not. The whole issue is, are we prepared to deal with the pandemic or not? Did we take it lightly or not? I think that the answer there is very emphatic, that the government of the day, and I would say central government, certainly was careless, was not even thinking about the kind of response that is required to deal with the pandemic.
Going forward, the situation, like you say, is already very dire. But going forward, what do you think needs to be done? If you were to list just 2-3 things, which, I think state governments will also play an important role here on. But what are the 2-3 things you think the government should be doing immediately?
I think one is that there has to be a change in the policy paradigm. One has to realize that this is no longer a kind of a cyclical shock. It's not something which is like it happened 1 year and then so it's not the financial crisis that it happened and then it is something which has basically raised questions on the way the economy is structured. And those questions can no longer be avoided. I mean, for the last 30 years, most of the governments have basically tried to push the more difficult questions to the subsequent governments and take the easy decisions themselves and take credit of the reforms. I think this is something which the mindset has to go out. I mean, we can't see a situation where we can say that supply is going to create its own demand and the Say's law is not going to be valid anymore. We have to think about where the economy is going, and that will require understanding of where the revenue is to be generated, what is the role of fiscal policy, what is the role of inflation management, what is the role of income distribution. Those issues have to come in the picture. And I think that's a broader question that I'm not putting in, for which I don't think either many of us don't have an answer, but at least we should start talking about those issues. We should actually be discussing those issues. Number two, in terms of vaccination or in terms of supporting the economic recovery. And states have to be given their due share, not just the due share in terms of GST share, but at least should be given the flexibility of taking the decisions of recovering the economy in the rural economy or wherever they are doing it. I think that's something which has to be a big understanding. Unlike the government, which is like believes in centralization, it has to go into more of federal kind of a more state-driven thing. Those are broad principled issues. The third one is where I can give you some kind of idea of what is concrete. I think really the concrete what the government should be doing is to simply pumping in money in the economy. Whether it is in terms of rural areas or in terms of urban areas, it has to simply pump money to keep the economy. Right now, the economy is in ice.
Forget about the fiscal deficit at the moment.
Forget about the fiscal deficit. And I really think that the monetary policy and fiscal policy, there's not so much of a contradiction in that, as long as we have the main objective very clear. The problem with this government is that the objectives are not very clear. If the objectives are clear, then I think there is a mix of monetary policy instruments that are available to you, fiscal policy instruments that are available to you. Both can be combined to achieve a particular objective. But when the objective is not very clear, then you keep on blaming the monetary policy, and the monetary policy will keep on blaming the fiscal policy for the mess that is being created. I think the objective should be to ramp up income, to create demand in the domestic economy, to provide some level of protection to the large majority of the population, which is currently in need of government support, whether it is the agricultural sector or the non-agricultural sector in the rural areas, whether it is the informal sector, which is lost jobs or lost incomes. Those need to be protected because those are ultimately the bulwark which will basically drive the growth the next decade or decade after that. And I think we can't simply go into the assumption that it is the private corporate sector whose profits are the ones which are basically going to drive the economy. That understanding has to move out. Then I think the number of instruments that are available to the governments are many with them. NREG is there, social pension is there, food security is there, various rural infrastructure programs are there, through which money expenditure can be. And these are all worked out. I mean, we don't have to now create those channels. I mean, those are channels that thankfully we have created those channels for the last 40, 50 years. We need to simply use those channels to create the kind of a demand that is going to come in the economy, which is going to drive the economy. I think all of these issues, some of these are grants issues which will require the government to shut up the ego and understand that the states have to be given the importance. There has to be a change in the way the economic policy is framed and to understanding of what economic policy can achieve in the short run and in the medium run and in the long run. And finally, the use of the instruments which are already available rather than going for new instruments or trying to figure out grant standing where you don't have the ability to deliver on those ones. I think these proposals with a little bit of humility will go a long one in protecting the economy, making sure that the economy at least is back on the stable course. Whatever little that we can think of is, I think, the immediate priority be passed on for the next government.
Well, I mean, I think, like you're saying, the basic problem is not that we do not have the instruments to deal with the crisis, but I think you're articulating that the basic problem is that the government is yet to even acknowledge the extent of the crisis. Thank you very much, Himanshu, for sparing your time, and let us hope that policy making actually recognizes the kind of crisis we are in, and we at least start making a recovery, which we are saying is anyway going to be a very long and protracted process. Thank you so much, Himanshu, for sparing time with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Roshan, for having me here.